It's not just that President Trump is talking about reopening the country. Some states are starting to do it. I want to talk a little bit about Georgia today, and then talk about, with the Republican governor, Brian Kemp, and then talk a little bit about what's happening nationwide, what it means, and as the provocative, inflammatory title for this video suggests, try to figure out a little bit what's going on, who's going to die, and why. So I went to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, one of the premier papers of the country, and certainly a good place to turn for news about Georgia. So I'm going to share a little bit of their reporting. Governor Brian Kemp, yesterday, Monday, issued a, I don't know what you call it on a state level, but he basically decided to allow certain businesses, gyms, barber shops, tattoo parlors, and bowling alleys to reopen their doors this coming Friday. Theaters and drive-in restaurants will be allowed to reopen on April 27th, next week. One confusing element of this is Kemp's statewide shelter-at-home order remains in effect through the end of the month. So the governor is telling businesses you can open, telling consumers you can't go there. Now, it's not a laissez-faire reopening. There are conditions. Reopened businesses will have to follow social distancing guidelines, screen workers for fever and respiratory illnesses, and take other steps to minimize the risk of transmitting the virus. And before I go any further, and I am going to go further, I do want to make one quick note here. We're going to bash the Republicans pretty severely, I hope, in this video. But Democrats don't have an extraordinarily high moral horse from which to do this, because it's not too easy to fault Republican governors for deciding they've done a good job, they've done all they need to, when Democrats are out there hollering about what a fantastic job Andrew Cuomo has done as the governor of New York. New York, by the way, of course, having by far, the worst outcomes of any state in the nation, Republican or Democratic. So, and by the way, it's not like a coronavirus bomb went off in New York that no one could have predicted. Governor Cuomo, his response had numerous shortcomings, numerous failures, and does to this day. So when we, and I don't mean you, I know you watching this are all super well informed and don't make tribal statements. But when we, the larger we, talk about how great Andrew Cuomo is, why wouldn't a governor whose state has 1/10 or 1/50 the deaths of New York State say, well, hell, if that's what a great job looks like, I am on fire. Among the other things the state will do is beef up contact tracing. We're talking about Georgia now. Dr. Henry J. Hyman, clinical associate professor at Georgia State University School of Public Health, told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, quote, "Tell me all those things are in place, testing, flu-like symptoms in emergency rooms, so on and so forth. Tell me all those things are in place and hospitals are ready for a worst case scenario and we're prepared if it flares back up, then okay," he said. Point being, of course, those things are not all in place, right? And this is one of the analogies I thought of for this is obviously it's the way viruses work is they prey on our terrible intuitions, right? The minute deaths start to go down, we think, oh, it's okay, as if it's, as if it's winter and it's going to inexorably continue to decrease. That's not how it works, of course. The minute you let up, if it's still there, it's going to flare back up again. The analogy I referred to before is when a terrorist strikes And this is a tactic in war as well when you have snipers shooting. But it also applies to terrorist bombing. A very time-tested technique of bombers is you set off the bomb, you blow people up, you kill people, the first responders show up, they start to clear things out, take care of the wounded. That's when your second bomb goes off. And the analogy is not perfect, and I don't like using an analogy that involves intentionality on one half of the equation, because the other half has no intentionality, and it is a bad idea to refer to things that have no intentionality as if they do. So the president should stop calling it smart. But the fact remains, if you act like the danger is over, the moment the peak of the previous danger is over, you are setting yourself up for that second strike. You are facilitating it. Kemp was among the last of the nation's governors to impose statewide social distancing measures, and now is among the first to begin lifting them. Will Bentley, the president of Georgia's Agribusiness Council, a member of Kemp's coronavirus task force, said last week, quote, "We can't live like this forever," which is such a bad straw man, it really doesn't even belong in the argument. Or if it does, it should get pushback. No one is proposing living like this forever, right? If a public figure like this makes a straw man argument, you either ignore it or you explain that it's not that it is a straw man argument. Here's where it starts to get especially messy. Kemp said the easing of business restrictions would be uniform statewide, quote, and will be the operational standard in all jurisdictions. Now, here's what that means. Kemp said, quote, local action cannot be taken that is more or less restrictive. In other words, if your city in Georgia is a hotspot, you have nursing homes left, right, and center, and they're all clustered around, a big stadium. You are not allowed, according to Kemp, to impose measures that take that into account and are more restrictive. And of course, yes, absolutely, this flies in the face of the supposed so-called, Republican mantra about local control. The same thing happened when Kemp first imposed shelter-at-home orders, saying it superseded stricter local measures. So towns that acted before Kemp did, when they imposed their own measures, if those measures weren't as strict as Kemp's when he imposed them, he actually forced them to undo them, to roll them back, to be more lenient. That was his response. Mayor Bo Doro of Albany, Georgia, where nearly 100 people have died from the coronavirus, said he fears the governor's action will undermine efforts to stem the virus's spread. This is quoting the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Quote, "I think the decision is irresponsible," Doro said. Quote, "I'm flabbergasted that the governor would say we can't take additional precautions to protect our citizens. This isn't a mixed signal, it's a U-turn." The Atlanta Journal-Constitution also had an editorial. This is different from an op-ed piece. This means the newspaper itself, their editorial board, wrote this. And I want to read a fairly big chunk of it, not for the opinion so much, but for the information that they're offering, which is really important for context to understand just how wrong-headed this thinking is. And by the way, yes, Kemp, if you had forgotten, as I did, Kemp was the one who said, I believe only a couple weeks ago, well into this crisis, that he had no idea prior to that, the moment he was speaking, that asymptomatic people who did not have symptoms, could transmit the virus. That is how profoundly, deeply uninformed and incurious and bad at fact-finding for himself this man has been. So here's a big chunk from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's editorial. Quote, The state ranks among the nation's worst for its number of COVID-19 cases and the deaths. And remember, testing is a necessary component of anything resembling a safe reopening. The state, quoting again, the state ranks in the bottom 10 in testing per capita. Experts say the state still lacks the testing capacity needed to detect the true scope of the disease, as well as the resources required to trace the contacts of infected persons in order to isolate future outbreaks. Georgia has many more cases than we know about because only a small fraction of us have been tested. In fact, only those with the strongest symptoms qualified for testing until recently. Let's also remember the state's weak data gathering. For example, until last week, the state only attributed death to COVID-19 when diagnoses were confirmed by laboratory tests. By omitting symptomatic people who died before they could be tested, the state understated the problem and lacks a true picture of the pandemic. So just to pause for a recap, they don't have enough information about what has happened, and they don't have the capacity to address whatever it is, whatever the true state is of their crisis going forward. Quote, some might excuse the governor for these problems. He inherited a state with a history of poor health outcomes, weak public health infrastructure, and underfunded agencies. Others might say he's done little to improve things during his tenure. That debate will have to wait. That debate does not have to wait. This is one of the primary things, rhetorical devices, that is killing us. This idea, A, that it's a debate, and B, that it has to wait. The crisis is the time when you focus on the crisis. What other time is there? And to say he inherited a state with a history of poor health outcomes, weak public health infrastructure, and underfunded agencies is to pretend that he was not a part of and a party to the party that did that. This was a man who cheerleaded it and was a part of making that happen. And others might say he's done little to improve things during his tenure because it is true that he has done little to improve things during his tenure. The debate does not have to wait. The debate is over. Yes, he inherited a state with a history of poor health outcomes, weak public infrastructure, and underfunded agencies. He helped make that happen and did nothing to change it. Both things can be true. He inherited a state in crappy condition, and he's responsible. And the same thing is true, of course, of Donald Trump. He's complained that he inherited, and it's a lie, he complained that he inherited poor testing regimens and poor stockpiles, both lies, of course. He's been president for 3 years. He's had 3 years more to have done something about it. Not just in response to the alleged crappiness that he inherited, but how about in response to the warnings his own administration, his own people issued to him about a coming pandemic. He did not take office in January of this year. If you're going to claim credit for the stock market the morning after the election, 2 months before you take office, you do not get 3.5 years after you take office to say, well, I inherited bad things. It is privilege on steroids. Sorry, it went a little nuts there. I want to go back to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution editorial. Quote, but when Kemp referred to improvements in contact tracing and offered few details, he seemed to brush past showing how the state would develop an important anti-pandemic weapon that heretofore has hardly been mentioned. The contact tracing and ramp up in tests promised by Kemp are still weeks away. Even if everything goes smoothly, and nothing has gone smoothly so far. The governor and other leaders must acknowledge realities around the pandemic in Georgia. We lack systems to conduct widespread testing, which is the single most important matter as we consider reopening our state. So I somewhat provocatively titled this a murder-suicide pact. And the suicide angle is relatively apparent, right? If a state, whether it be a nation or an actual state in a federalist system, decides to do things that will kill members of that state, members of the body politic, not in the name of some greater cause, right? Like liberty or, well, I guess that's pretty much the only one we're allowed to, we're not allowed to do it for the betterment of people's lives, just liberty, individual autonomy. But those kinds of sacrifices are generally made, the sacrifices of lives are generally made when the threat, the thing you would have to endure otherwise, is eternal, right? Servitude would be eternal. Living under tyranny would be eternal. A lockdown is not eternal. If you have contact tracing, if you have testing, universal testing, widespread testing, we're talking about a matter of weeks. It should have been over by now. The reason all those white gun-toting male idiots aren't free isn't because of the government doing something to them. It's because it failed to do something for them, which should have been very simple and which the government has the power to do. You force companies to produce the masks that are needed, the tests that are needed for a short period of time of widespread, virtually universal testing, screening, social distancing, and yes, contact tracing. If we didn't do that, that's why we're still here. So let's get to the murder part of this equation. It's murder when you're doing it to someone else. And I wanted to read from a column by Greg Sargent about this aspect of it. And I'm going to start off a little far afield, but we'll get to it. He's talking about Trump encouraging these protests, these rallies, inciting with the claim that democratically elected governors are tyrannically oppressing their constituents with these restrictions. Trump is speaking to a small minority of Americans. But this jarring juxtaposition will not disturb Trump. That's because it's an important feature of what Trump is really up to here. Trump's assertion that people's lives were, quote, taken away, unquote, by these governors could theoretically be just a figure of speech. But given that Trump has repeatedly called on people to liberate states from such governors, the phrase doubles down on the idea that this taking was an illegitimate usurpation. And he gives a number of examples, one of which especially I wanted to note. In Denver, protesters carried signs saying things such as, quote, dangerous freedom over government tyranny. He writes, obviously it's entirely within these protesters' rights to register their opposition, however dangerously wrongheaded, to these governors' policies. The problem is all the rhetoric suggesting that their rule is fundamentally illegitimate. And I wanted to make a note here. He's got a little bit more that I want to cover, but I want to make a little bit of a note here. All of these people claiming that they love freedom enough to go out and protest for it, when protest is dangerous, right? You see some of these morons wearing masks while saying coronavirus is a hoax. That's how unthoughtful, how deeply unthoughtful these people are. Where were they when the government, when it was safe to protest and the government was out there rounding up Muslims and suspected Muslims after 9/11? Where were they when Congress and the president were pushing vastly expanded surveillance of anyone the government wanted to listen to? Where were they when it was revealed that the government had gone beyond even the legally authorized infringements on our privacy? Where were they when it turned out that we were torturing people? And yes, the answer to the explanation for some of this is, well, that's because they're racist. And that is true of some of them. And some of those people may be irredeemably racist, and obviously they're deplorable. They are not good people, and they are a blight on society and should be shunned and condemned and all of these things. Some of them are rescuable. As with every cult, people can be deprogrammed. So it's important that we leave open avenues for these people and say, you know what? You don't have to be deplorable. It is a choice. But the bigger problem even than the brainwashed folks is the people who buy into a story that does not rely on racist narratives, the people who believe this idea that freedom is at stake here without understanding that the context reveals it to have racism in its DNA. And here's where we get to the murder part. I promised I would come back around to this. Sargent points out that the New York Times reports that in Michigan, the coronavirus is, quote, concentrated in heavily black and Democratic Detroit, unquote, even as the protesters demanding relaxed social distancing are, quote, nearly all white and are, quote, hoisting Trump signs and Confederate battle flags. And there's, sorry, let me give his last thought here. This is the story Trump tells when he tweets that urban, that's a code word, congressional districts are rat-infested hellholes, or when he mocks urban America as a foreign country before Heartland rally crowds. We also saw this in Trump's musing about quarantining off East Coast blue states as if to protect virtuous red America, often described as real America by his propagandists, from getting infected by a disease exported by depraved blue America. So one of the points Greg makes here that I didn't address is that there's a notion of illegitimacy that's being slapped on to Democratic Party governors who are imposing these measures, that they are illegitimate rulers, that they are acting against the will of the people, never mind that polls show a huge majority of people support these measures. And it's also in line with the people who elected those Democrats. They are Americans, but they are people of color. They are not the they're not the rednecks who support Trump. They're not the sheep who support Trump. And so, despite the fact that they are Americans, they too are seen as illegitimate. Their votes do not count. They are not real America. And here's where we get to the really sort of insidious part of this. When we talk about the cities in Georgia that are being prevented by their white Republican governor from imposing from imposing limits, conditions, requirements that their own people favor, we are talking generally about plurality, or in some cases, majority black cities. The coronavirus, for pre-existing social and economic reasons, already hit black people and other people of color worse than white people. What we're seeing now, and how consciously this is, I can't say. In some people it is, and in some people it's not. But what we're seeing now is an effort that if you believed in intelligent design, this would look like intelligent design, puts black people and other people of color in dramatically graver danger than it does the white protesters lugging around semi-automatic rifles that cost, hundreds of dollars. They're wearing their privilege, not just their idiocy, on their chest. And so the struggle for us, I think, is to figure out what is the narrative here that appeals to people who do not think of them as racist, right? And part of that narrative is that there is something real at stake here that's worth standing up against, right? The notion that our society should be allowed to continue on. And by the way, that's not a terrible idea, right? It's important to see what's appealing about the ideas, or else you're never going to get why it appeals to people. This notion that we should be able to stand up for it and we shouldn't have to live this way forever is very appealing. But the problem is it leaves out that this is not forever. And it leaves out the fact that it's only stretched on this long because we did not have an effective, coordinated, yes, top-down, massive federal response to this. Had we had that, a thought out, concerted, unilateral, top down, semi-authoritarian in the sense of commandeering companies for a limited period of time. Not, by the way, without compensation. They'd be paid for it. Had the federal government done all that, we would pretty much be at the end of this. And no one would be thinking about, having to go out there and fight for our liberties or whatever. Okay, I've gone on for way too long. So, one thing I do want to note is that I've been told that the quality of the video is not that great because of the crappy connection that I have where I am. So one thing I'm thinking about is maybe doing more pre-recorded videos, which I would then upload at 11:30 so that we're still on time for our regularly scheduled broadcast, and then join you guys in the chat afterwards so that we're still able to have a conversation and have feedback and all that. Actually, not just afterwards, but as it plays out, the chat goes on. Anyway, so if you have thoughts on that, let me know. In the meantime, let me try and find where you folks picked up. You know what? Actually, I think I only kind of hit the real meat of it at the end. So I'm going to start backwards and go up. Eric Anderson says, nah, keep it live. I will keep that in mind. Most likely what I'll do is I'll experiment and do a little bit of both. But I just wanted to bounce it around. Travis Guy says, there will always be outliers in everything, but that isn't the majority. That's another really good point, Travis, which is that these protests are getting a vastly disproportionate amount of attention from our media because they are quote unquote good video, which by the way, apparently Iraq war protesters were not good video because they got nowhere near, proportionately speaking, this amount of coverage. Cubicle Peon says, video quality isn't a big deal. Your content and commentary are appreciated. Well, thank you very much, Cubicle Peon. I appreciate that. I wanted to make some joke about Peon being your last name, but I appreciate the sentiment, having been a Cubicle Peon myself at points in my life. Tom Mallard says, for the need to open borders, airports, and arenas, etc. globally, use fever scans to reopen venues. These are the first tests to perform. Well, Tom, I'm certainly not against that the use of fever scans, but my concern is that there's a huge proportion, it seems, of people who are asymptomatic, e.g. no fever, who could still come into these venues and spread it. Travis Guy says, collectivism only wants people better for the collective, not for yourself, regardless of what the individual wants or believes. Well, I mean, it's all in the definitions, right? It depends how you define collectivism. But if you're part of the collective, then it is better for yourself. And obviously, the utopian form of collectivism is going to maximize individual autonomy. It's going to find the best balance there, right? It's going to make things so much better collectively that you actually have more choices, right? You have you can make the argument that a caveman living in anarchy had maximal individual choices, or excuse me, individual autonomy, right? There were no laws preventing the caveman from doing what they wanted, but they could not go on a roller coaster ride. So I guess the difference is between autonomy and choice. You can actually have more choices and have less autonomy, right? The caveman couldn't get in his car and drive somewhere because they were on a road. You can have, but if you want the choice of being able to get in a car and go on the road, that means giving up the autonomy to drive on the sidewalk and kill people. I think that's a fairly one-way trade-off, right? If you know, autonomy is useless if your choices are that limited, right? So autonomy, I think, is greatly overblown and really has a lot more to do with this, you know, I hate to use labels, but it really does feel like a toxic masculinity thing where the idea that anyone tells you you can't do something is horrible. regardless of the fact that you actually have much more choices if you accept that trade-off, right? You know, if our caveman is starving and another caveman has food, that other caveman doesn't have to give it to caveman one, right? So caveman one can starve and have autonomy, or maybe caveman two says, you know what, you can have some of my food, but you have to sit at the damn table and you have to use a napkin. That's I suppose that's limiting caveman one's autonomy, but he's got a hell of a lot more choices and he's got food. So I tend to think that it's a false I don't know what the term is, but you guys know what I mean. It's a false trade-off, this idea that you have to give up freedoms when the collective does better. The freedoms that you give up are trivial because they're just the payment for the vastly expanded choice that you get. All right, this is not working for me, going backwards. So I'm going to start up at the top, I think, again. And I'm actually not going to go too long today, I don't think. Adolfo Serrano says TYT against TYT, ha ha ha, run TYT, TYT for a reason are capital letters. I so thoroughly have no idea what you're talking about. I apologize. And whether you're criticizing TYT or pointing something negative out about it is immaterial. I'm happy to address it. Not everything necessarily. I'm not going to address everything, but if it's a reasonable complaint or critique, I will do my best. Mr. Elder says, how can I wear a mask so my glasses don't get fogged up? So I don't know the answer, but if you Google it, I've seen that it's actually out there somehow. Travis Guy says, it's sad to see people not understand how the economy works. Without it, we die. Wars, either civil or international. No more hospitals, no more food. The economy is the lifeblood of a nation. So, Travis, I don't think anyone's saying we should not have an economy, right? The point is, what does our economy do? What do we want it to do? And what do we not necessarily want it to do? And what is required for it to do? The only reason a landlord, for instance, requires their rent in any given month is because they have other payments that they need to make. So there is actually a class of payments, transfers of money that could in theory be suspended if everyone is sort of given immunity, right? If no one has to pay rent and none of the landowners have to pay taxes or mortgages on it, then that aspect of the economy can actually be on hold for an indefinite period of time. And other aspects of the economy can continue, and the government can play a role in sustaining the parts that need to and ensuring that the parts that actually don't need to can emerge in whatever form we decide we want after the fact. But it's important to keep in mind a couple things. One is that an economy can take lots of different shapes, right? And our economy is shaped by government policy and regulations and corporate behavior and all these kinds of things. And it has changed, right? We used to have an economy, say back in the 50s and 60s, that while it excluded a lot of people, while it limited access to the ladders of social mobility, the structure that it had was pretty good. It allowed for adversarial relations with labor that gave labor an equal footing. And so the cause of the middle class was pretty well represented and pretty well served, again, with the exceptions of people who were shut out from the system entirely. So we know what that looks like. And we could, in theory, have that again, just literally by repealing the laws that undid that or restoring the laws that did it in the first place. And the other thing is that the economy is not the lifeblood of a nation. When we talk about the economy, we tend to talk about benchmarks and metrics, things like how the stock market is doing. Those are intended to capture things that we think tell us about how people are doing, right? You can argue that economic financial transactions are the lifeblood of a nation, but a nation worth having has other benchmarks that are less tangible. Education, reading, arts. These are all things that make life worth living. And yes, to some extent, they are all dependent on a healthy economy, but that doesn't have to be the economy that we had before the coronavirus crisis or the one that we have now. So it's a little dangerous to just worship at the feet of whatever we think the economy is. Mr. Elder says, nope, the economy is not the lifeblood of the nation. The people are the lifeblood of the nation. No people, you have no nation or even economy. Imperator 1 makes more succinctly the point that I made. How do you define economy? Travis Guy says, you want food? Economy. Well, not necessarily. You can grow food. You can give food to other people, right? These are things that in theory you can have without an economy. I'm pretty sure people were eating before there was an economy. I'm pretty sure animals eat without having an economy. We need the economy to eat because of the system we have created. It is not a given. It is not a law of physics. Every time there's a point made in the comments, I address it, and then I scroll down and I realize someone else has made my point better and earlier. Okay. All right, guys. I'm going to call it a day. I've got a couple stories I'm working on, so I'm going to call it a day. I mean, at least for the chat. I'm not I'm not calling it quits for the day. But I will remind you folks that we're here every day at 11:30 a.m. And I don't do this enough lately, but if you don't already subscribe, please subscribe. It really does help us. Occasionally we get money in the super chat, and that's great, but if we can demonstrate that we're growing, that more and more people are interested in what we have to say, the context that we offer, our original reporting. You heard from TYTI last week on a news story that he's got up. I hope you'll check it out at tyt.com/investigates. But so please subscribe and please share what we're doing here, whether it's the commentary here on YouTube or our original reporting over on the website. And you can also follow me on Twitter and TY on Twitter. I'm JT Larsen, he's TY Chang. And you can find TYT Investigates on Twitter as well. The handles are all what I just said. So with that said, now someone just hit us with a super chat. Who was that? Zane, thank you. Thank you very much, Zane, for the donation. It's very much appreciated. And boy, especially these days when everyone, even if you've still got a job, everyone's got, you know, uncertainty about what the future holds. So I don't know. Maybe it's egotistical, but I like to think that putting money into TYT is like investing in a better future. I feel like a cheeseball even saying that out loud, but boy, I hope to some extent there's some truth in that. Anyway, thank you all so much, and I'll see you. No, I won't see you tomorrow. Tomorrow's T.Y. Chang at 11:30. I'll be back on Thursday at 11:30, and in the meantime, take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and try to address the stories that the people we disagree with are telling themselves, rather than writing them off as evil. Let's view them as cult members and try to rescue them with love, always with love. Bye, guys. Take care.